Matt Schaff and Jared Small of DraftSharks.com here to preview week 2 of fantasy football. We're going to talk some rankings. We will answer some stardom, sit-em questions that people are considering this week. Before we get to those, though, Jared, we just on Wednesday afternoon posted our first trade targets article of the season. We're going to do that every week with guys that we're buying, guys we're selling. Who is one player that you're already considering selling after week 1?
Winning trades now can really give you an advantage. If we can kind of get out ahead of this stuff, I know we've only seen 1 week of data, but if we can kind of make the right calls, you can really win trades. I'm trying to get out of Rachaad White. How much longer can this guy survive as Tampa's lead runner? He was one of the least efficient runners in the NFL last season. Week 1 of 2024, 2.1 yards per carry, negative 2.2 rush yards over expected per attempt, 33rd among 34 qualifiers in week 1. He was near the bottom of the league in that metric as well. Basically, that's telling us he's getting fewer yards than an average running back would. He's just been a subpar runner. Bucky Irving, 6.9 yards per carry in his debut, beat Rachaad White in PFF rushing grade, beat Rachaad White in rush yards over expected per attempt. So White came away with a solid week 1 because of the pass catching. And listen, I think he's going to continue to do that, which will keep his value afloat, but he's also not going to play the Commanders every week, right? That's one of the easiest matchups the Bucs are going to see all season. So I think White is a shaky RB2 at this point. If you can get more value than that from him in a trade, I would go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and the thing I always like to throw out when we're talking about buy, sell, hold is just because we put somebody in a buy or sell or whatever category, it doesn't mean you have to go do this right now. You don't have to go sell Rachaad White for whatever you can get right now. It's a good time to go ahead and try to sell him because things could get worse based on the factors that Jared was just talking about. I've got a running back as well, and it's kind of the opposite case because Ramondre Stevenson performed very well in week 1 and has been an efficient runner at plenty of points throughout his still young career to this point. He's coming off a 25 carry, 120 yard, 1 touchdown game in the win over the Bengals, 5th most rush yards over expected per attempt. So again, performed well, but he remains in a bad situation to be a running back. The Patriots did win that game, surprisingly. They still only scored 16 points. They came in under 300 total yards. They ran the ball on 61% of their plays. So New England was playing from ahead in this game against Cincinnati. Not something I expect them to do a whole lot this year. And there was also likely further benefit for Stevenson from Antonio Gibson dealing with a hip injury that had him questionable for the game. It popped up during the practice week. I don't know exactly how much it affected his playing time, but with that team playing from ahead, they certainly didn't need to mix in Antonio Gibson. And when they signed him, they talked about him being a third down tight. So that to me says he really has a chance to take away some of the receiving work from Stevenson, which is where Stevenson has been less efficient. So if we get, more of a run first Stevenson going forward, if we get more receiving going to Antonio Gibson and we get this team performing a bit more overall like we were expecting heading into the year, I think it's just going to be a not great position for Stevenson to be a running back, and thus maybe you sell right now on a potential peak in production.
32 running back carries for the Patriots in week 1. I'm very confident they're not going to get to that number again this season. The Gibson thing is huge because Ramondre Stevenson did run her out on 72% of pass plays in week 1, 13% target share. If he holds something like that, he can be like a low-end RB2 for you because even when the Patriots are trailing, Stevenson's going to remain involved. But if Gibson starts to eat into that, and like you said, Matt, if the hip injury was a factor in week 1, that's where Stevenson's in trouble because, again, the Patriots are going to be playing from behind more often than not.
Yeah, and by the way, they were 4th worst in the league on yards before contact per attempt in week 1. So that's a signal of the offensive line concerns that we had heading into the season. If you are looking to make a trade this week, the Trade Navigator is waiting to help you on DraftSharks.com. Here's how this tool works. You can go in and say, I'm looking to give up a running back. I'm looking to get a receiver. And the Navigator is going to scan your entire league through that league sync that you use for your draft war room. It ranks every roster in your league by best fit for that pursuit. The rosters that have a wide receiver to give you and could also use the running back that you're looking to give up. Build that trade package when you find that potential partner. You will get ratings on the impact, not just to your roster, but the other one. And when I say ratings, it's not that system where it's like, yeah, your side is this many points and that side is this many points. It's looking at the actual impact because that's what matters more than you winning a trade. You can check for this upcoming week and check for the rest of the season. And yes, the Trade Navigator works for dynasty trades as well. So if you're a DS Insider, go check it out. Jared, let's move on 2 position by position week 2 calls for our lineups. We're going to start with quarterback. The buzzy name, I think, at quarterback right now is Justin Fields, who started week 1. Seems like he's in line to start week 2. We'll be watching Russell Wilson. But are you starting Justin Fields? Are you picking him up to start over any other guys that you might have drafted?
Yeah, I mean, I think Fields is the top streaming quarterback this week. He's a top 12 quarterback in our rankings. I mean, just to give you an idea, the guys we have right behind him, Tua and Brock Purdy. Joe Burrow is next on the list. I would play Fields over Burrow. I thought Fields played well enough last week. The passing numbers obviously weren't big, and I don't think they're going to be big. Obviously, the Steelers want to win, conservative on offense, play defense. But Fields, of course, does a lot of rushing. That's where he gets his fantasy value from. 14 carries in the opener, 10 designed carries, which were tied for the most among all quarterbacks. In week 1, we like that. That makes that rushing production easier to rely on. And then he gets Denver in week 2 here, who was one of the worst run defenses in the NFL last year. Gave up 146 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground to Seattle in week 1. So I just think, again, I don't expect big passing numbers out of Fields on Sunday, but I do think the rushing production is pretty safe and at least gives him a pretty high fantasy floor.
Only Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson among quarterbacks had more carries in week 1, and Fields was actually unproductive on those 14 rushes versus what he's done in his career. So I certainly like his rushing potential there. I agree with him right around the bottom of QB1 territory. One guy that I would not play him over is Jared Goff, and they're very close together in our QB rankings. So to me, if you have Jared Goff, it's not worth getting Justin Fields to play him this week. And if you would have both of them already, I like Goff better. He's coming off a disappointing week 1, just 217 passing yards, 1 touchdown in a game where Detroit scored plenty of points, 34 to beat the Rams. Only 28 pass attempts in a 50-50 run pass split. That's the biggest risk with Goff, is that Detroit likes to run the ball. They very well might be able to run the ball this week against the Bucs as well. Tampa has been a pass funneling defense. They allowed the 5th most passing yards in the league last year, 5th fewest rushing yards. And this week, the Bucs are in even worse shape for stopping the pass. They're going to be missing safety Antoine Winfield for a while because of an ankle injury. They might be missing starting corner Zion McCollum to a concussion. Detroit's got the highest game total this week by nearly 3 points, according to the Vegas numbers. I think there will be plenty to support everyone. I think we should expect a better passing day for Goff, even if there's not much more passing volume in this game.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think that Sunday night game was not Goff's best real life game. It was obviously a pretty disappointing fantasy game, but I'm just going to continue to lean on his history playing at home since he's been a Lion. He's just been awesome. And like you said, Matt, great matchup here. Super high implied total. Goff is a top 10 quarterback for us this week. I would start him over Fields as well.
Brock Purdy had kind of a quiet game for another team that scored plenty of points in week 1. What are you doing with him for week 2?
Yeah, and we talked about Brock Purdy as a sit last week in that tough matchup against the Jets with Brandon Ayuk coming off the extended layoff. I think no Christian McCaffrey hurt Purdy in week 1. We're projecting McCaffrey to miss week 2 as well, which hurts. That said, I do think Purdy's in a much, much better spot this week versus the Vikings. Much worse secondary than what the Jets have. San Francisco's 25.5 point implied total, tied for 6th highest on the week. And again, we're projecting no Christian McCaffrey this week. I think Brandon Ayuk is going to be much closer to Brandon Ayuk this week, which obviously helps Brock Purdy.
Yeah. Brock Purdy last week was somebody that I was wary of because of that matchup against the Jets. This week, he's just somebody that I'm not excited about. There's nothing that should turn you off about the matchup. We did see Brock Purdy struggle at Minnesota last year in the middle of the season, but I'm not sure that we should really do anything with that. The limitation is this is a team that wants to run the ball. They had the 4th lowest pass rate versus expectation in week 1. I would expect that they will look to do the same at Minnesota.
Yeah, the volume's always the concern with Purdy, right? You're kind of banking on that crazy efficiency that he had last year and even the year before that. I would say that, if you trust the PFF grades, Purdy played well in that game against the Jets. PFF had him as the 3rd best quarterback of week 1. So really no concerns with Purdy himself. It's really just the Niners got to get these weapons going, right? Again, McCaffrey, is he going to play? Then Ayuk, how's he going to be after, missing all of training camp?
Somebody that we drafted ahead of these quarterbacks that we already talked about, but that I would rather sit behind them for week 2 is Joe Burrow. And Jared, I don't know what to make of him flexing that right wrist during the game against New England. He has been on the injury report both week 1 and week 2, all full participation though. So if I can help it, I would rather watch Joe Burrow this week than have him driving my lineup.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. I mean, he's quarterback 14 in our ranking. So like not a must sit, but they're guys, someone like Justin Fields, someone like Jared Goff, off, I would pretty easily play over Joe Burrow this week. I didn't notice the wrist as being a factor in his throwing watching that game. That said, it was obviously a really ugly performance from the Bengals offense. T. Higgins didn't play in that one. I'm not expecting T. Higgins to play this week either. I mean, he hurt his hamstring last Thursday, did not practice again on Wednesday. So, and that's a concern because this offense just doesn't really have much beyond Jamar Chase. Tough matchup too in Kansas City against a good Chiefs defense. I think what's working in Burrow's favor, he should have volume on his side this week. The Bengals bangled last week. They were easily the highest offense in pass rate over expected. They're generally in the top 3 there. Burrow threw just 29 times last week. We have him projected for 36 and a half pass attempts this week. He could easily get up above 40. So even if the efficiency isn't, where it usually is for Burrow, pass volume could carry him to a decent fantasy day.
Beyond the other quarterbacks we talked about, I think I would probably start Baker Mayfield over Joe Burrow this week. I can understand if you don't want to. Mayfield's on the road, but he did have a big game at Detroit in the playoffs last year. Then we're getting down to like Trevor Lawrence, Matthew Stafford. I think it's more if you want to, fine. I don't love the matchup for Trevor Lawrence, and I don't love the numbers that he put up in week 1. So I would probably lean Burrow there, and I would hope that most rosters don't have that combo of quarterbacks because it means you probably overspent on your QB2 if you did draft Burrow.
Yeah, I like Baker quite a bit this week. Played well in week 1. Should be a high-scoring game in Detroit. Bucks underdogs. Passing volume should be on his side. Stafford's the other interesting one. Bad Cardinals defense and what should be a high-scoring game. Stafford, I mean, he's obviously missing Puka Nacua. He's missing at least 2 of his offensive linemen, so I'm just worried about what those injuries could do to that offense. Although I think the Cardinals defense is bad enough that the Rams offense should be fine in this game.
Yeah, that's one of those where I wouldn't be at all surprised if Stafford outscores Burrow. I'd be okay with starting Stafford over Burrow, but I think I would probably lean Burrow on my own team. We'll see come the weekend if I have that decision to make. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. You will get notified every time we drop one of these waiver shows or preview shows, and we get the feedback that you like the content. So that just makes it that much easier for us to figure out how much time we should be spending on this stuff week in and week out. Running back decisions now, Jared. Josh Jacobs comes up first, and he is inside our top 24 at running back for week 2, but just running back 22 in PPR. That's low versus his ADP, which is about running back 12 or 13. Should see plenty of touches, but the concern is obvious. There's no Jordan Love, and that's probably going to dramatically change the offense.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where, like Jacobs' slice of the offensive pie grows, but the actual pie is just going to get much, much smaller with Malik Wilson there. It's going to get smaller, I think, as far as plays run. There's, probably not going to be to control the ball, convert third downs like they would if Love was in there. Efficiency is going to be down. I think Jacobs' touchdown potential is going to be down with Willis in there. The Packers are only implied for 19 points. The Colts' run defense did just get smoked by Joe Mixon in week 1. So, I think if the Packers can control the ball a little bit, if Willis can be just good enough to, keep them on the field, I think Jacobs could have a nice game. I think you're probably starting him in most cases. He's 10 spots lower than he'd be in our rankings if it was Jordan Love under center.
Jerome Ford, I think, is an example of somebody who went much later in the draft that I would feel more comfortable with using this week over Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, agreed on Ford. Nice usage in week 1, especially in the passing game.
DeAndre Swift had nice usage in week 1 as well. The bad news is he stunk for fantasy. I don't know, semi-better news on that front is the entire Bears offense stunk. So it wasn't so much his fault as it was all of them being awful. That limited DeAndre Swift's total touches, but he still controlled that backfield and looks like a solid option, assuming that the Bears rebound, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't love Swift this week. I mean, he's kind of right. He's actually right behind Jacobs in our ranking. So he's, a guy you might need to start if you have to. I don't think he's a bad play because, like you said, Matt, the usage as far as playing time was nice. Looking longer term, I do think this Bears offense gets going eventually. So I think Swift could be a buy low this week after a really ugly week 1 in the box score. But he did play 70% of the snaps in week 1, ran her out on 63% of the dropbacks. Roschon Johnson was a healthy scratch for that game. Khalil Herbert was 3rd among running backs in snaps. It was Travis Homer as the Bears' number 2 running back in that game, which to me is bullish for DeAndre Swift because, we know Homer, we know what he is. He's not really a threat to take more work from DeAndre Swift. So it seems like Swift is like the Bears' clear lead back. And if that offense gets going, he could still be like a really nice RB2 for fantasy teams.
I think they're likely to be trailing in this game at Houston. So like you, I'm not excited about Swift this week, but I do think that he's in for a rebound because the offense is going to be better at some point. We'll see exactly what they look like. It's one of those situations though, where you're not shocked by a sluggish start, rookie quarterback, new OC, lots of other new pieces. So they'll pull it together there at some point. One other shocking week one result at running back was J.K. Dobbins' production, and his role was good there as well. Is he already in starter range for week two?
He is, partly because how good he looked in week one and partly because the matchup this week against Carolina. So, yeah, I mean, Dobbins, 10 carries, 135 yards and a score in the opener, led all 34 qualifying running backs in rush yards over expected per attempt and yards after contact per attempt. Dobbins split rushing work right down the middle with Gus Edwards. I think, we'll probably continue to see something like that, at least in the short term. Maybe Dobbins starts to pull ahead a little bit now. What I like, though, is that Dobbins controlled passing game work for the Chargers. 57% route rate, 12% target share. So even if he's getting, half the running back carries on this team that we know wants to be run heavy and getting the majority of the passing down work, I think the passing game stuff definitely helps his weekly floor and ceiling. And then this matchup against Carolina, I mean, they already looked like one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. Then they lose their defensive tackle, Derek Brown. I mean, the Chargers could run for 200 yards in this game, and I would not be surprised.
Great start for J.K. Dobbins. I don't want to overrate the great start and turn him into a for sure weekly starter going forward, because it was a good situation against the Raiders, another good situation against Carolina. We did still see Dobbins split carries, as you said, with Gus Edwards. I would expect that they would like to keep things in that range where they're not overworking Dobbins, even if he remains the clearly better runner than Gus Edwards. He is coming off of that Achilles tear from last year. So another split backfield in Tennessee. We expected more of a split, though, than we got statistically in week one. The numbers make it look like Tony Pollard dominated work in week one. He did technically on carries, 16 of those to Tajay Spears' 4, but they each got 4 targets, and the playing time was a lot closer than that carry split would make it look, right?
It was, the company line out of Tennessee all summer was that these guys were going to be interchangeable. That's not what we saw at all in week one. Tony Pollard played 35 early down snaps to 11 for Tajay Spears. Spears 17 snaps on either third down or in the 2-minute drill to just 1 for Tony Pollard. So it was Tony Pollard as the early down back, Tajay Spears playing majority on passing downs. Not dissimilar to what we saw last year, honestly, with, Derrick Henry. Tony Pollard's almost in the Derrick Henry role at this point with, I think, some additional receiving work as we saw in week one. And then Tajay Spears kind of is still in that mostly passing down snap. So Tony Pollard's obviously the better start at this point. I thought he looked good. PFF had him 4th in rushing grades for the week. He was 8th in rush yards over expected per attempt. Obviously a tough spot for both these guys, though, against the Jets. The Jets were just smoked by Jordan Mason, but that's the 49ers running game. That happens. I do think that's still going to be a tough run defense. So, Pollard's sitting in RB3 range in our week 2 ranking. Spears is someone you don't want to use unless you have to.
And I believe Brian Callahan said after that game that he would like to get Tajay Spears the ball more going forward, right?
He did. He's going to have to play him more on early downs if he wants that to happen. I mean, we'll see. We'll see. Again, this is all week one stuff. Like this could be game plan based stuff for a lot of these teams. It could look completely different in week 2. So that's always the tricky part as we, head into the second week of the season.
Another split backfield in Denver where we might not have anybody to use in week 2. We expected a Javonte Williams carry lead. Not what we got in week 1, right? They were kind of reversed.
Yeah, exactly. And the usage was kind of reversed as well, where you had Jaleel McLaughlin playing more early down snaps, 19 to 15. Javonte Williams, 7 snaps on third down to 5 for McLaughlin. Javonte also played all the running back snaps in the 2-minute drill. So it's more McLaughlin early down stuff, more Javonte passing down stuff, which is opposite of what I expected it to be. The big story in Denver is that the offense was horrible, and now they got to play a tough Steelers defense. So, it's tough to expect Denver to get much done on offense this week. If this usage continues, though, then, Jaleel is going to have almost as much fantasy value as Javonte. So, they're both sitting in like low end RB3 territory this week. You might have to use them, but they're definitely not confident fantasy plays for week 2.
Yeah, I would certainly try not to use either one, and they both are probably going to keep sitting in RB3 territory if the usage stays similar to this, and if the offense stays similar to what we saw in week 1. We'll see where things go. Wide receiver up next, and Marvin Harrison Jr. is getting talked about this week for all the wrong reasons. The fact that he barely did anything in week 1 against Buffalo is part of why I didn't want to touch him at all at cost, because there's a wide range of outcomes. As good a player as he is, we don't really know what to expect in the pros, and we're going to probably need a little bit to find out what we should expect. So what are you doing with Marvin Harrison Jr. this week? And I guess what's the reaction to last week?
I mean, he just flat out didn't play well last week. You can search his name on Twitter and you'll see clips of him just not creating any separation. It looked like he just felt lost out there, right? Which is not surprising for a rookie. Like the guy got I think he played in the first preseason game a few snaps, but he didn't play at all with Kyler Murray, obviously. So he just looked like the game was too fast for him in week 1. I think he's going to settle in. What he did in college and his measurables, they're too good for him not not to get it going. And the fact that you took Harrison, either at the end of round 1 or early round 2, like it's probably going to be tough to bench him this week. I will say the Bills really under Sean McDermott have been good at limiting the opposition's number 1 wide receiver. Last year, for example, they allowed the 3rd fewest yards per game to opposing number 1 wide receivers. That's kind of, what the defense does. They're going to make other guys beat you. And it does look like they gave extra attention to Marvin Harrison in that game. So I think it's a better matchup for Harrison this week against the Rams, who obviously just gave up the big game to Jameson Williams. Should be a high scoring game. So he's definitely not a comfortable fantasy play. But again, I think in a lot of cases, you're just going to have to roll with Harrison again this week and hope for better results.
I thought number 1 wide receiver Greg Dortch did fine against the Bills in week 1, but I know that's not what the numbers say from last year. I think that there are 2 ways to look at this. I think in general, it's too early to give up on or bench a guy that you picked in the early rounds. As you said, likely round 2, maybe round 3 pick on Marvin Harrison Jr. here. So in general, I would say the guy that you drafted in round 2 or round 3, you drafted him there for a reason. And even if he had a troubling week 1, you should probably go ahead and play him in week 2. I think it's a little bit different for Marvin Harrison Jr., though, if you can afford it, because he is a rookie. And even if he struggles for the first month of the season, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's a bad player to have on your roster. We know historically rookies at wide receiver get more productive as the year goes on. We usually get the best stuff from them over that second half of the season. So you could still have Marvin Harrison Jr. pay off for you later in the year. I would try not to play him this week if I have other good options. Not saying sit him for, whatever's on the bench that was fine last week, but there are some guys behind him, and we'll talk about some of them going forward. There are some guys behind Harrison in this week's rankings that I would feel more comfortable using this week. And I think it's okay to say, I'm going to see what the rookie does in week 2, and then we'll judge week 3 as we get to it.
Yeah, Harrison's actually 24th in our wide receiver ranking, so lower than I actually even thought. I mean, you do have Texans guys right behind him, tank down Steph Diggs. I think you could even consider starting those types over him. So yeah, Harrison definitely not a must start. Like, don't feel like you need to start him just because you took him in round 2. But like you said, Matt, I wouldn't go far down your bench.
Yeah, I think it's a different decision. Marvin Harrison versus Devontae Adams. Like, they were both probably drafted in the same range. I think Devontae Adams is a player where you're like, I drafted him in round 2 because he's Devontae Adams. I'm going to go ahead and start him in week 2, even though he disappointed me in week 1. Harrison, we don't know yet. Week 2 could look more similar to week 1 than the rest of the season does. So not exactly the same calculation. Make sure you look at the specifics of that player. Amari Cooper, talking about specifics of the player, wide receiver 29. So he is in starter range for 3 wideout leagues, but that's even a bit lower than his wide receiver 25 ADP after a week 1 where nothing looked good for Cleveland. The positive for Amari Cooper, though, he led the entire league in air yards, Jared, and was just 12th in air yards share. So it's not like he had this crazy share that's not sustainable. Now, can his quarterback turn any of those air yards into actual yards?
Yeah, that's the question. I'm running out of any hope for Deshaun Watson to get this figured out. Cleveland did have to throw it 45 times in that game against Dallas. They trailed throughout. Watson was aggressive. He had a high average depth of throw. That's where, a lot of those air yards for Cooper. 9 targets, 20% target share, pretty solid number there. He had a ball go just off his fingertips in the 4th quarter that would have gone for a 36-yard touchdown. So if he, reels that in, you're feeling better about him. I still like the usage. I think this matchup's okay this week against Jacksonville. They just lost one of their starting corners, Tyson Campbell. That helps Cooper's matchup. It really comes down to Watson, who just needs to play better. Cleveland also needs to get their starting tackles back. They were missing both of them in week 1 against a really good Cowboys pass rush. That made it tough on Watson. We did have Jack Conklin put in a limited practice on Wednesday. Jedrick Wills was still sidelined on Wednesday. So maybe they get one of those guys back. That'll help. Cooper, to me, is a guy I'm probably going to play in DFS this week. I think he has the upside at, hopefully will be low ownership coming off the dud. He's an uncomfortable play in season long. But again, if you have to use him as your wide receiver 3, at least know that the usage was there in week 1.
Yeah, I think it's a fair range for him. We do know that at least Deshaun Watson is overly aggressive lots of times, and that his decision-making stinks in all facets. Jameson Williams, I think, is low in our rankings this week. He's in low wide receiver 3 territory, and it's okay to temper expectations on him after he's been disappointing heading into this season. But to me, we got exactly what we needed in week 1 after an entire offseason of buzz from Williams, where he had the big receiving line, 5 catches, 121 yards, 1 touchdown on 9 targets, tied his career high in receptions. It set his career high in targets, nearly doubled his previous high in yards, a career career high snap rate by a wide margin. So basically, like everything supported the way that they were talking about him heading into training camp and then the regular season. I would play Jameson Williams more like wide receiver 24 level in my week 2 decision making.
Yeah, see, and I thought we were being aggressive ranking Jameson Williams at wide receiver 32 because that is about 15 spots higher than we had him in the preseason rankings. And I'm in on Jameson. I think he's going to have a big season. I think there's going to be a lot more big games to come. The concern is that, we're still talking about a Lions offense that we know wants to be run first. There's still Amon-Ra, St. Brown. There's still Sam LaPorta. There's still Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, there's going to be games where Jameson Williams gets 4 or 5 targets and disappoints you. I think that's why, to me, most weeks he's going to belong in wide receiver 3 territory just because the floor is not where, other guys that we can count on, 6, 7, 8 targets. Williams' floor is just lower, but the upside is right there with, all these guys in the top 20. He's someone I want to get in starting lineup this week. And again, he's in wide receiver 3 range. So I think for a lot of people that drafted Williams, he's going to be a starter for you. I'm just not quite as excited as you, Matt.
Yeah. And I don't want to misrepresent it and say that I see him as wide receiver 24 the rest of the season. But I think this week, when we are going on very limited data, what we do know is that we love this offense, that it has the chance to support him even on lower targets, that they love to get him the ball downfield. So even if he gets fewer targets, he has big play potential. And the matchup that we talked about back with Jared Goff, the Bucs are not good in the secondary to begin with, and now they're missing the best player in their secondary and probably 1 or 2 corners. So I'll go ahead and take advantage of the matchup and the talent on the player, and we'll see what the targets do to help me out.
Yeah, no, I'm with you again. I'd be looking to get JMO in my starting lineup if at all possible this week.
Xavier Worthy is somebody that I'm a little bit more wary of from the week 1 production. Jared, he finished as wide receiver 11 in PPR, scored 2 touchdowns. So I think pretty much anybody who had Worthy and didn't play him last week is like, crap, why didn't I play Worthy? I'm definitely playing him this week. Why is that maybe not what they should do?
He scored 2 touchdowns on 3 touches. Like, that's the argument against Xavier Worthy. Now, one, I'll say, I bet he's going to be an outlier all season in terms of efficiency. Type of player he is on this offense, I think he's going to outproduce his volume. The other thing I'll say is that he ran her out on 77% of pass plays in that opener. That matched Rashee Rice for the lead among Chiefs wide receivers. So Worthy was on the field. Our ranking right now of Worthy, wide receiver 35, assumes Marquise Brown is not going to play. And he did not practice on Wednesday. Andy Reid was talking about how the shoulder still hasn't set how it needs to set. I'd be surprised at this point if Marquise Brown plays. If Brown plays, you're going to see Worthy drop 5 to 10 spots in our rankings, because then I think the playing time and targets would be a bit shakier. But if Brown's out again, Worthy is basically a full-time player. He's a poor man's Jameson Williams at this point for me, right? Like, you can't count on the volume, but you're just, hoping for a big play. And I do think he's a pretty good bet for a big play.
He might even be the same thing as Jameson Williams. I mean, they're both first-round picks. They're both in good offenses that we want to get pieces of. So, yeah, it's just the lack of volume. And we'll see. I think the volume will pick up. I don't think he's going to be a 4 opportunity per game guy all year, but we'll see how soon that picks up. And I'm not sure last week's Bengals are capable of pushing Kansas City to more passing volume than the Chiefs might plan for this game. So Worthy is somebody I'd be fine using, not somebody that I would feel like I need to get in my lineup just because I missed out on his 2 touchdowns last week. Guys that I would like to leave out of my lineup if I can this week are the Packers wide receivers. And it's totally because Jordan Love went down at the end of week 1 and Malik Willis is not good at football, at least at the NFL level. The fact that Green Bay traded for him at the end of the preseason is much more damning of their previous backup quarterback situation than it is supportive of Malik Willis going forward, because the team that drafted him and has been developing him went out this offseason was like, we have to sign Mason Rudolph and fix this backup quarterback position. So when your team is like, Mason Rudolph's an improvement over you, pal, it could be a death blow to your long-term NFL outlook.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Willis has 67 regular season pass attempts. He has a 52% completion rate, 5.2 yards per attempt, has not thrown a touchdown. He has 3 interceptions. The other thing too with Willis, I mean, we know Green Bay is going to try to run the ball as much as possible. Even when they drop back, like for starters, Willis is going to take off and run on some of those. You're not going to get a pass attempt. The other thing is Willis has an 18.3% sack rate in the regular season so far. That's like, Daniel Jones thinks that's bad. You're not going to get many pass attempts from the Packers. They're going to be inefficient pass attempts. Jaden Reed sits highest among Packers wide receivers in the rankings. It's not just because he had the big week 1. It's to me because he's like the manufactured touch guy. They can, maybe Willis can complete some, 1-yard passes to Jaden Reed. Maybe he gets like 2 or 3 carries in this game. Hope he breaks off a big play. Like that's why Reed is still in the wide receiver 4 mix for us right now. But ideally you're not using any of these Packers receivers this week, and really until Jordan Love gets back.
Yeah, if I have to play one, it's Jaden Reed because he's thin Debo, but I would like to not play any Packers wide out, at least until Malik Willis proves that there is a reason to do so. Tight end decisions this week. I think the first one, probably, no idea how many people are facing it, but Mark Andrews versus Isaiah Likely went completely opposite of what anybody would have guessed in week one, and now leaves us questioning both players, one negatively, one positively heading into week two. So let's start with Mark Andrews, Jared, because to me, he's a case of what we kind of talked about earlier with not giving up on a proven producer just because of one bad game to open the season. He was coming off a disrupted preseason, as we mentioned in a previous show. The usage was still fine. Mark Andrews faced lots of double coverage against a team that had seen him plenty of times before. I'm just going to bank this week on that being a bad game for Mark Andrews and things turning around probably as soon as this week. Even if we don't get a full rebound, I think that he'll be at least okay as my tight end starter for week two.
Yeah, I think okay is a good way to put it. I think Andrews is going to be fine. Is he going to pay off the price? Maybe not. We'll see. You said, Matt, his usage was fine last week in terms of playing time. I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, he ran her out on 75% of dropbacks. That's okay, but it's definitely lower than it was in previous seasons. And I think, Isaiah Likely has something to do with that. So I don't know what situation you could be in where you'd be benching Mark Andrews, especially how bad tight end was in week one. Like, you're going to be starting the guy. He's tight end 7 in our rankings, tempering expectations. But again, I think he's going to be okay. If I had to bet, I would still bet on Mark Andrews scoring more fantasy points this season than Isaiah Likely.
Yeah. Now, if you picked up Isaiah Likely, then you can start Likely over Andrews this week. We can't say that it won't work out. Maybe that was just a preview of, a dramatic increase in usage. And I do think that we're in for a dramatic increase in usage for Isaiah Likely. I just don't think that we're going to get anything close to week one. And even beyond the two players individually, Baltimore is just not going to pass that much. That was just the 6th time in his career that Lamar Jackson hit 40 pass attempts. He did so once all of last season. He did so 0 times in 2022. So we're probably going to get less pass volume. That's going to affect everybody. I'll be watching the Mark Andrews usage that you just alluded to. I'll also be watching Isaiah Likely's usage to see where that sits. He is also inside of our top 10 at tight end. So even though I would not expect to play him over Mark Andrews, there are, guys that I drafted earlier that I'm okay with starting him over this week. Most notably, I think Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz, right behind Isaiah Likely in our week 2 ranks at the moment.
Yeah, to me, like, our top 8 tight ends are kind of locked in, and that ends with Brock Bowers. I would not start Likely over any of those guys. I would play him over Goddard. I think Likely versus Evan Ingram is a decision this week, only because Ingram has a really tough matchup against Cleveland, who was they were a top 5 defense against tight ends last year, and I think they probably will be this year again too. So I think, going forward, Ingram will probably be clear ahead of Likely, and we'll see what Likely does in week 2, obviously. But I think this week it is a decision. I would lean towards Ingram just with the target safety. I think he's a safer target bet. But again, I would play Likely over Goddard, and I'd play him over everyone down from there, which at that point you're kind of talking about tight end 2s basically.
And all that said, it's worth noting that if you got Likely, then you probably paid a lot for him on waivers this week. So in that case, we're just ranking them, not assuming that we paid to get any player, just looking at the numbers and projecting them for the week. If you paid that money for him to get him off of waivers this week, then you might as well, in most cases, go ahead and bet on him for week 2. If it's anything close to week 1, then it's paying off for you. If you start him and he doesn't pay off for you, then it might be revealing itself as a mistake on waivers. But either way, I think that's part of making that big gamble. You're betting that this guy is going to be a lot better than anticipated. So you might as well go ahead and take a shot on that in your lineup.
Yeah, and we've said week 1's probably going to be his best game of the season, but not many tight ends have the upside to do what Likely did in week 1. So at a position that stinks, generally definitely stunk in week 1, and we'll see how it goes. Likely at least has that ceiling.
If you did not pay for Isaiah Likely on waivers this past week, maybe you got Colby Parkinson for a lot less. And his Vegas line is just 6 yards shy of Likely's heading into week 2, 29.5 yards at the moment versus 35.5 for Likely, 34.5 for Brock Bowers, 33.5 for Goddard. And Parkinson is ahead of Hunter Henry and Zach Ertz in that category. So Parkinson looks solid for week 2, right?
Yeah, you buried the lead with the 35-yard over-under for Isaiah Likely's receiving line. Again, keep that in mind as you're deciding whether or not to start that guy. Colby Parkinson's tight end 13 in our rankings this week. So that's where we're at tight end already in week 2 here. The playing time was strong last week, which we expected, right? With Tyler Higbee out, Parkinson Parkinson's going to be the guy for the Rams. He ran her out on 82% of Rams pass plays, 10% target share. So not a great number, but again, Puka Nacua out, that volume should climb. And then he gets this Cardinals matchup again. We think the Cardinals are going to be bad against pretty much everything this season. Should be plenty of points in that game. So I think Parkinson, if you don't have one of those, locked in starting tight ends, I think Parkinson's your top streamer for week 2.
Let's close things out as we always should with Taysom Hill. And Jared, we got lots of hype about his new role in the new offense. It didn't really seem to pan out in week 1, despite all of the yards and points for New Orleans overall, right?
I mean, that was a funky game. That game was over by the end of the first quarter. I think it was 17-zip at the end of the first quarter. Hill wound up with 5 carries and 2 targets. He played 21 offensive snaps. That was only 32% snap rate for Hill. 12 of his snaps came in the backfield, 5 of them as an inline tight end, 3 in the slot, 1 at quarterback. He's almost like their RB2. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if, we come out of this week 2 game against Dallas with Taysom Hill finishing, second on that team in carry. So that's not what you want in PPR and even half PPR, right? And this is what we talked about with Taysom Hill. Like in non-PPR, he is a borderline top 12 tight end. If you're in a PPR league, it's just tough because you really can't expect more than like a catch or 2 out of him.
Yeah, in full PPR, I would probably not want to roster Taysom Hill because he's going to be at least as frustrating as he is helpful, and you're going to have to decide when to start him. So I would try not to have him there. But in non-PPR, you're just going to have to kind of take the inconsistency and chase the high weeks for Taysom Hill. And, we'll see what the usage looks like when they get into more competitive games.
Exactly. I'm looking at it now. I mean, he's tight end 9 in non-PPR rankings. He's way down at, tight end 15 in PPR. So again, scoring format matters.
We have talked about rankings, but your best starter recommendations are going to come from your team intel page. Just like Jared just said, scoring format matters, lineup settings matter. That page takes into account our projections, consensus projections, ceiling projections, your scoring and lineup settings, and it gives you one clear view of who we recommend starting for your specific situation that week. So if you have not become a DS Insider yet and taken advantage of the team intel page, you can find a link in the show notes below to get there. That is the best way to make sure that we are your unfair advantage.